Today we are going to present NASA's early stages, how it developed, and the NASA's space program from its beginning till the end. So this is a kind of a documentary, and in next videos we will try to present those videos in parts, and later on in all the videos you will see various recent technological advancements by NASA. So let's start the history of NASA, how it started, and eventually now in this year where we are, what NASA is doing now. So in July 1969, the crew of Apollo 11 was preparing for the United States' first attempt of landing men on the moon. NASA, the space agency charged with making the mission possible, had existed for a little more than a decade. Apollo 11 was the first of six successful moon missions, the result of an unprecedented surge in scientific and engineering activity with remarkable spin offs. This is the story of how Cold War uh, paranoia and incredible expenditure paid off in less than 9 years. United States went from space amateur to technological hyperpower. In 1950, America, life was good. The economy's vast productive power had switched from making tanks, ships, and aircraft during the Second World War to cars and refrigerators. The United States could dominate in the world in a responsible capitalist sort of way. America had emerged from the Second World War as the unchallenged nuclear armed superpower. But there was a problem. The Soviet Union had finished the war with a giant battle hardened army, and the country soon had its own nuclear weapons, becoming the world's second superpower. Its communist ideology, calling for international revolution, was a direct threat to the West. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had been working to extend their nuclear strike capabilities by developing missiles technology. Here, the Soviets were too disadvantaged. Their primitive warheads were big and cumbersome. They had to design rockets capable of lifting much heavier loads. But in October 1957, the Soviets surprised everyone. The heavy lift 7 rocket had sent Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. The 83 kilogram sphere was equipped with nothing more than a beeping radio transmitter. 2 days later, the Soviets tested a giant thermonuclear bomb, and America couldn't help but link the two events. Gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially in an enemy country, can do this if we fear this. In December 1957, America was preparing for its first satellite launch. A Vanguard rocket was to boost a tiny 1 kilogram payload to orbit. Coast to coast citizens were watching. It was an intense humiliation for the United States. Just days later, Soviet delegate to the UN asked whether America would like aid earmarked for underdeveloped countries. President Eisenhower had wanted a non-military rocket to carry his nation's first satellite, but the Redstone missile, developed for the army by Vera von Braun, was given the directive to salvage national pride with a second attempt. They would use the Juno 1. In 1958, free men everywhere lifted their gaze to Freedom Satellite. It was a success. Later that same year, the Eisenhower administration established NASA to coordinate the country's space efforts. Sooner after, NASA recruited its first 7 astronauts. They were all test pilots. At this time in 1959, the United States had attempted 20 satellite launches. Only 8 could be successful. In 1961, the Soviet Union's sprang another surprise. His name was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. He would become the first cosmonaut. On the morning of April the 12th, Gagarin was strapped into Vostok 1. It carried air and food for 10 days. If its recently rockets failed, Gagarin could last until his crabs orbit the decade naturally in 108 minutes. Vostok 1 completed one orbit and landed safely back in Seoul. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard was preparing to become the first American in space, NASA's new Project Mercury. Before dawn on May the 5th, Shepard was delivered to the launch site 2 hours before the scheduled liftoff. This would be the first manned flight of the Redstone launcher, but the Redstone did not have the power to reach orbit. This would be a suborbital, hot in the spirit of Cold War. Shepard had called his Mercury capsule Freedom 7. There were weather delays, and Shepard had been strapped into his seat for 3 hours before the flight started. Freedom 7 took him to a height of 187 kilometers, ending 15 minutes later. In the Atlantic, where the capsule was picked up by a waiting aircraft carrier, it was successful, but compared to Gagarin's orbital flight, it was a poor second. Then, after another 3 weeks, there was a further development. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. This seemed like a very rash proposition. When President Kennedy made his speech, his country had only successfully launched 12 satellites. The United States had made a further 16 attempts, which had all failed. The Atlas booster, due to take the first American to orbit, was still having problems. But a new fast track program under the direction of German engineer Dr. Werner von Braun had been underway for several years. A new launcher, the Saturn I, was an attempt to surpass the Russians' heavy lift capability. It would use a cluster of narrow tanks that could easily be fabricated using the tooling developed for the country's existing rocket fleet. It would also cluster 8 rockets engines to deliver the required thrust. The engine used was the H1. It was a direct descendant of the engine that powered Germany's V2 rocket. After the Second World War, Ferno von Braun and some of his team of rocket designers had surrendered to the American forces. With them came hardware and extensive drawings. Tests began in New Mexico using modified V2's blueprint for the V2's engine were given to North American Aviation, who implemented proposed improvements mentioned in the Nazi documentation. A spin-off company, Rocketdyne, handled their work and are still making rocket engines today. In developing Saturn I, there was a change in the approach of the engineers. They were keen to avoid the high rates of failure that had occurred with other rockets. This meant that all components would now be tested exhaustively before undertaking a launch. This included the H1 engine, which was required to deliver 99% reliability. Finally, in October 1961, the first Saturn was ready for flight testing. It was a giant first stage with a dummy second stage and nose cone. As it sat on the pad taking, fuel technicians were methodically checking the rocket subsystems. So this was time consuming and would later be monitored by computer high speed film cameras, were focused upon elliptical areas of the payload launcher's interface, the technique that continues to this day. The first test of a new rocket design was never expected to go well, but the Saturn I performed flawlessly. It was a small step towards President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon. Although Congress was allocating huge sums for what was now called Project Apollo, NASA still had no clear idea how they could do it. There were two competing approaches: direct ascent, where astronauts would ride a huge craft directly to the moon, landed there, and then turn on Earth. Rendezvous, where two rockets would launch separate parts into Earth orbit, which would link up and then fly to the moon and land. There were various concepts for a spacecraft that would fly from the Earth to the moon, land, and then return. All were huge. Both of these approaches would require a rocket of huge proportions and design. For the giant nova were studied, there was a third method proposed, which required a rendezvous in lunar orbit. It called for a dedicated lunar lander, which could discarded after it served its purpose. Langley engineer John, who Bott was convinced that this was the only way to get to the moon within President Kennedy's 1969 deadline. So, in July 1961, Gus Grissom had become America's second astronaut with another 15-minute suborbital flight. At this stage, to craft rendezvous in orbit was seen as a tremendous challenge. Her rendezvous in lunar orbit was seen as madness, and who bolts a lunar orbit rendezvous was dismissed, but who bold an informal group working at the Langley had been studying the problems associated with orbital rendezvous since the 1950s, and they understood the mathematics well. Very frustrated at having the lunar orbit rendezvous plan blocked from access to higher management. So he wrote a strongly worded letter to NASA administrator. In it, he asserted that the only way to meet the presidential deadline was for. He insisted that a man could be put on the moon without the need for NOAA, with the LOR concept now in open. The theory and the calculations were scrutinized closely, and while the idea was still resisted under the plan was sound, finally when Furno von Braun became convinced, lunar orbit rendezvous was adopted. In August 1961, Germany Tito was operating to become Russia's second cosmonaut 825. He remains the youngest person to fly in space. His flight in Vostok 2 made 17 orbits, with Tito remaining aloft for more than a day. He was the first man to eat in space, the first man to sleep in space, and the first man to suffer from space sickness. NASA were resigned to their second ranking in what had become known as the space race. With the newest version of the Atlas booster, they felt they were closing the gap, and unmanned flight went well. But they were still worried too. The humiliation of the astronauts corps, Chimp 81 later called Enos, would be the first to fly on. The Atlas, it was the first caps you will to have solid state electronics. There were some small problems during this flight, but Enos returned safely, paving the way for NASA's first manned orbital flight. In February 1962, John Glenn was to be the first American to go into the orbit. In capsule hit named Friendship 7, the American people were taking their country's role in the space race very seriously. Now, Glenn's flight was an opportunity for the U.S. to salvage some pride. John Glenn completed 3 orbits and returned to an Atlantic splashdown without incident as development continued successfully on the Saturn booster and the Mercury program began more ambitious missions. NASA was getting a clearer view of its path to the moon. A new group of astronauts was recruited with names like Neil Armstrong, Johnny Young, and James Lovell, and lunar orbit rendezvous plan meant that a new program would be implemented before Project Apollo. So, from here, we're going to continue and tell you more details. So, what happened next after this? So, this is very important to watch related to this journey. So, originally called Mercury to the program eventually emerged as a Project Gemini, a larger version of the Mercury capsule that would carry two astronauts was rapidly designed. It featured ejector seats like a jet fighter, and it would be boosted to orbit atop a refinement of the Titan II missile originally intended to carry a nuclear warhead. Training for the two-man missions began ahead of a tightly packed schedule of launches. Additional Mercury missions were scrapped. There were very specific objectives laid down for the Gemini program. Orbital rendezvous had to be mastered, and docking with the target vehicle had to become routine planner. Also known that any trip to the moon would involve leaving the spacecraft and surviving in the vacuum of space in a pressure suit. New infrastructure was built at Cape Canaveral, a giant vehicle assembly building for the coming Saturn family of rockets was commenced. In Alabama, a captive rocket test facility was built, and there were new engine test stands constructed in Mississippi. At the new Manned Space Center in Houston, Texas, a new mission control hub was constructed. It would monitor every detail of every mission, largely due to the energy of Vice President Lyndon Johnson's. Texas was to become the focal point of America's space effort. It was September 1962 before a crowd in the stadium of Rice University in Houston. That gave such a warm welcome to our President of the United States. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. This was the saying of the president. Decade and do the in this decade and do the other things not because they are easily, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Though the American people were largely on side with the country's space goal, Kennedy understood that the huge expenditures now being made could easily lead to an erosion of the national support. But in little more than 12 months, when President returned to Texas, he was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was now the president. He strengthened his position in 1964 with a landslide win in the presidential election, and under his leadership, America's space objectives remained unchanged. In August 1962, the Soviet Union had set another space first. Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 orbited at the same time. So NASA felt the Russians were already working towards orbital rendezvous. So in June 1963, another cosmonaut was preparing for another first voyage. Valentina Tereshova will be the first woman to go into orbit in October 1964. Vladimir Komarov, the commander, flight engineer, Konstantin Feoktistov, and medical specialist Boris Yegorov flew to orbit on a new spacecraft was God won, and they wore normal clothing, not spacesuits, to NASA. It seemed that the Russians were citing their own equivalent of three-man Apollo program. Towards the end of 1964, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov began training with a new piece of equipment. As was hot, capsule would be fitted with a collapsible canvas airlock that would let him leave the craft. The was hot capsule's electronics used thermionic valves which relied on ambient air to dissipate the heat, so the capsule could not be depressurized. In March 1965, Alexei Leonov on Boss Good became the first person to leave his capsule and float freely in space. Again, the Soviet Union had beaten America in one of the capital steps NASA had stated it would need to master before an attempt at landing on the moon. The complete story did not emerge until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Once outside, Leonov's spacesuits swelled like a balloon, making him too large to re-enter the airlock. Only by drastically venting his suit pressure could he squeeze back inside. The Gemini spacecraft was a huge advance in capsule design. Mercury astronauts Gus Grissom had been involved in the capsule development and was responsible for the way pilot control systems reassembled aircraft. Aircraft controls like Mercury capsule, it had corrugated titanium skin, but its life support system and power were housed in a separate module that was discarded before re-entry. The astronauts had separate hatches and sat in ejector seats. Importantly, these hatches could be reopened and closed in space to allow for spacewalk. The first manned Gemini flight, Gemini 3, blasted off in July 1965 aboard for Gus Grissom and John Young. 3 orbits and 5 hours later, their craft landed in the Atlantic just west of the Bahamas, 84 kilometers south of the intended target. Importantly, Gemini 3 had been the first spacecraft to change its orbit, a vital development towards NASA's short-term goal of orbital rendezvous. Grissom and Young's flight had been a morale booster for America's space effort, and they were treated as heroes. Less than a week after their return, the two astronauts were given a ticker tape parade through the streets of New York. People were now taking the idea of a moon landing seriously. At the White House, the astronauts met with President Johnson. In parallel with Gemini program, hardware for the Apollo missions continued development. The final configuration of the Apollo spacecraft had been decided and mock-ups were fabricated for use in testing other parts of Apollo system, because the Apollo command module was bigger than all previous spacecrafts. The designer had opted to return to the use of an escape tower similar to the Mercury capsule to lift the crew clear in an emergency. A special launcher known as the Little Joe was developed to test the escape system under a variety of simulated malfunctions. During one trial, a real problem occurred and the escape tower worked perfectly. Dummy capsules were dropped from aircraft to iron out problems with the landing parachutes. Because the Apollo missions would all splash down in the ocean, the capsule was tested in the water. There was always a trade-off between weight and strength, and sometimes the engineers had to go back to the drawing board. Testing of the new Saturn rocket and its refinement. The Saturn 1B was going well with no test flight failures. On the morning of June 3rd, 1965, Gemini 4 was being prepared for astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White. It will be their first flight. This would be the first mission control from the new integrated Mission Control Center in Houston. Launch control remained the cape, but after the launcher had cleared the tower, all aspects of the remaining Gemini and Apollo flights were controlled from this complex. This would be NASA's first long duration flight. An attempt was made to rendezvous with a tight in upper stage, but with little success and depleted fuel reserves, the exercise was abandoned. Above Australia, White and McDavid donned their spacesuits and began depressurizing the capsule. Eddie White had to struggle with his hatch door, which had jammed after attention from McDavid, who understood the problem. It opened and White stepped outside. He was tethered to the spacecraft by an 8-meter line that fed him oxygen to maneuver. He had a space zip gun that expelled oxygen. It worked well but was soon running low on the gas. Communication problem meant that while mission control could hear him, they could not speak to him. Messages had to be relayed via McDavid. It all looked deceptively simple, but other than be outside, White had no real task to perform around the world. These pictures captured huge press attention right from its inception. NASA had made a commitment to openness. It was the one glaring difference between America and its Cold War adversary. Jim McDavid and Ed White, both alumni of Michigan University, which held a ceremony for the astronauts when they were back on the ground. Although the Soviet Union may still be ahead in the space race, America was catching up, and the unfettered access NASA allowed the press meant that the Gemini program became a media phenomenon. For McDavid and White, there followed the now regulation ceremonial at the White House. Public support meant that lavish funding kept flowing and accelerated development of Apollo hardware continued. Behind the scenes, the testing of the Saturn 1 had concluded, and his direct descendant, the Saturn 6 1B, was being fabricated for several unmanned missions. It was earmarked for the first manned Apollo flight scheduled for 1967. The giant C5, now known as the Saturn 5, was also being built. This was the rocket that would take man to the moon. Unlike the clustered tanks hastily pressed into their service for the Saturn 1, Saturn 5 had larger, lighter line tanks, and it replaced the 8 H1 engines with 5 much larger F1 engines. Gemini 5 launched in August 1965. It was the first time a spacecraft had been powered by fuel cells rather than batteries. This would enable flights of much longer duration. But the system gave problems. In addition to the spacecraft, thrusters were unreliable. The crew of Gordon Cooper and Perry Conrad were forced to abandon a rendezvous exercise through diminished electrical supply and limited control of their craft. But Gemini 5 did set a new record for endurance. As Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford sat in their Gemini 6 spacecraft, and Atlas Agena on an descent pad was ready for launch. The Gemini capsule had been designed for docking, and in October 1965 they would make the first attempt to rendezvous and dock with the Agena target vehicle. The launch of the Agena was perfect, but shortly after, separation radar picked up 5 distinct objects. The craft has exploded. There was no point in proceeding with the mission. Scheduling for the Gemini program had been tight, with roughly one new launch every 6 weeks. There was no replacement. In January, to launch before the next flight, Gemini 7, it was decided that Gemini 6, now called 6A, would rendezvous with Gemini 7, which would launch first. This would mean a very rapid turnaround between launches, which used the same facilities in December 1965. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were preparing for NASA's longest duration mission, yet the plan called for flight of 14 days, more than long enough for a return trip to the moon. The schedule called for Gemini 6A launch 8 days later. Sure, our and Stafford had been through this exact procedure just 7 weeks earlier. There could be no faulty target vehicle to let them down. A plug had released every early forcing an automatic shutdown for a second time. Sharon Stafford had been unable to get off the ground. 3 days later, Gemini 6A launched successfully. Within 6 hours, that two Geminis were side by side. Rendezvous was one of the difficult maneuvers that had to become routine before a realistic attempt at landing on the moon could be made. So, we will continue from here in our next video, and we will continue this journey in detail. Stay with us.